Angela McArdle, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Okay, so we initially connected on Twitter because you were asking who should you talk to about strategizing to defeat the vaccine mandates in New York City, and I quickly found out you were in a debate in the Soho Forum. I don't know what was more bizarre about this debate about vaccine mandates, the fact that there was a libertarian willing to defend vaccine mandates, or the fact that you needed to show your papers to get into the debate. And thankfully, there was the organizer put on a live streaming house party that you didn't need to show your papers to. I was going to go to that, and I didn't get a chance, unfortunately. But it seemed like we should just bring the talk about strategizing on the show.
Yeah.
But before we get into that stuff, as a first question, I want to pose to you an argument, and I'd just like to hear your response. So here it goes. George Washington implemented the first vaccine mandate by putting it on his Revolutionary War heroes during the smallpox epidemic during the Revolutionary War. Therefore, vaccine mandates are as American as apple pie. What's your response?
I would say that just because George Washington says you should do it doesn't make it okay. And his version of a vaccine mandate was to make anyone who hadn't previously been infected with smallpox. So he actually provided, he allowed you to have natural immunity.
Yeah.
He actually had them go and rub themselves on infected sheep. So there was no injection. And close to 20% of the people became gravely ill or died. So it wasn't a good decision.
Today I have as a guest Angela McArdle to talk about strategies, legal and otherwise, against vaccine mandates. Angela McArdle currently serves as chair of the Libertarian Party of Los Angeles County and is a two-time candidate for California's 34th Congressional District. She has worked as a paralegal and legal aid for over 11 years. She currently works in litigation and also has a private practice where she provides self-help legal services to low-income clients. The bulk of her practice focuses on real estate and constitutional law. She was a key organizer for the Los Angeles 2013 protest against the ban on feeding in public rights of way. Angela believes strongly in the sanctity of personal choice and allowing people to govern their own lives. She received her bachelor's degree in organizational leadership from Biola University in 2009 and a paralegal certificate from UCLA Extension in 2013. She's also trained as a craniosacral therapist through Upledger Institute. As you'll see, her practice of craniosacral therapy does intersect with vaccine injuries. And the reason that I invited her on is because she is spearheading an effort in New York City to amend the city's charter. And I very much look forward to seeing how we can affect change in that way. But we have a conversation here more broadly about how do we in general strategize against vaccine mandates. And for those of us who come from any walk of life, whether our job is threatened or not, whether we live in New York City or not, how can each of us contribute to fighting against the mandates? So what you're saying today is George Washington, if he was around today, would make his soldiers have Omicron parties.
Yes, exactly. It's like a giant chicken pox party.
But it might not turn out good.
Yeah, and it was still a bad idea. So I guess making bad decisions is as American as apple pie.
Do we know anything about what Washington thought of that? Did Washington think it was a bad decision in retrospect, or did he just feel like that was the collateral damage that you needed, and then other people have pointed out that it might not have been a great decision?
I have read opposing views, but I haven't found any definitive statement of his that's verifiable.
Right. Okay.
At that point, it just sort of it disintegrates into different opinions on the internet.
Right. And so it just comes down to kind of estimating, well, if he didn't do that, how many of them would have died of smallpox? And, versus how many did when he did do that. Interesting.
Right.
Okay. So with that out of the way, could you kind of give us a little bit about, I know that you're chair of the Libertarian Party in Los Angeles and running for chair of the National Party for 2022. Is that correct?
Yeah, it looks like I'm going to be making a transition in probably May of next year.
Okay. And sorry, go ahead.
LA is it's larger than 40 or 41 state level parties. So for anyone who's wondering how do you jump from a county to national, it's one of the largest like libertarian organizations in the country. So that's how.
Yeah. I guess it would be a little bit like jumping from mayor of New York to something on the national stage, which would
exactly
be too difficult. And so before that, could you talk a little bit about your background in what were you doing before the Libertarian Party, and how does that kind of lead you into interest in medical freedom now?
So there were a few things I was doing before. So I've worked in litigation for about 12 years at this point, quite a while. And a lot of property rights stuff, some constitutional law. I've dealt with a lot of landlord-tenant stuff, and I actually have dealt with a lot of discrimination cases and things that have actually started to bleed into this mandate area. And I've also worked as a craniosacral therapist for about 8 years, on and off. That has been a part-time job that I've had, treating people with everything from sports injuries to vaccine injuries. And before that, I also worked as a medical research assistant for Dr. Pearl Grimes, and that is Michael Jackson's dermatologist, which is like an interesting little bit of trivia.
What does it look like for someone with a vaccine injury to get craniosacral treatment for it?
They have a lot of neurological problems, cognitive issues, brain fog, and sometimes just overall pain throughout their body. So they usually come seeking pain relief, and they usually come to us after they've exhausted all other options. Like you get at a certain point when you're experiencing this stuff where you're like, I don't care. I'll hug a giant purple crystal. I will ding a triangle over my head. You know, like my doctor is throwing me out. They're putting me on pain pills. They say I'll never walk again, or I'll have seizures my whole life. So we usually see people when they are absolutely desperate, despondent, suicidal sometimes, you know, not functioning very well.
And so because if there's neurological injury I'm just thinking of this from a biological point of view, if there's neurological damage from a vaccine injury, I would think that it would be probably autoimmune in nature. And I think of craniosacral therapy as kind of structural. So are you kind of directly fixing damage done by the vaccine injury, do you think? Or do you think it's more like everyone has so many problems that could be messing with their neurological system that you might not be able to fix whatever the immune response was, but you can fix the other stuff that they had wrong with their kind of anatomical structure, and thereby just kind of empty the bucket of neurological problems enough to improve the symptomology?
It's, I guess, kind of the latter. So usually their nervous system is incredibly inflamed and misfiring, and we're able to calm that down. And generally we recommend, you need to see a naturopath. You need to see someone who can help you chelate or get this stuff out of your body, like detoxify it.
Yeah.
But usually we're dealing with nervous system and how the body is, like, what would you say? How it's presenting itself. Like you're seeing the manifestation of those symptoms. And so we're trying to put those fires out so that they can now manage their health enough that they can go actually see someone who can get toxins out of their body.
Interesting. So did you get into that with having a background that made you specifically interested in vaccine injuries, or did that kind of pop up after you started doing that therapy, that just a lot of your patients or clients or whatever you call them were vaccine injured?
It just happened that a lot of them were vaccine injured. It was
interesting.
Like an interesting coincidence.
Did that kind of enlighten you to vaccine injury? Was that
It did. I mean, it was something that I'd always been kind of interested in. I've always been interested in natural health and just kind of suspicious of, like, why do you have to get an injection all the time? Why do you have to get so many of them? And I'm reading in kind of like, not literally natural news, but natural news outlets about the increasing vaccine schedule and things like that. And it just really, it never sat right with me. It never sat right with me.
Yeah.
And I was very active in California in 2015. We had this state level bill called SB 277 that was going to get rid of medical and religious exemptions for vaccinations for school children. And so I worked very aggressively to repeal that. And I went, really down the rabbit hole on everything related to vaccination and injuries once I got involved there.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, I've been vaccinated for everything that was on the schedule for someone born in the early 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of shocking how much has been added to the schedule.
Yes.
And I've always kind of put off thinking about it too much because I don't have kids. And so I always kept saying, I'll research vaccines when I have kids.
Yeah.
But then just kind of, the vaccine mandates have really pushed me into researching vaccine stuff in general. And to me, I have a PhD in nutritional sciences, and so my focus is very much on research analysis. And to me, it's just shocking how kind of corrupt the vaccine efficacy research is. So one thing that I've recently discovered is the test negative case control study. And this is a study where they estimate vaccine efficacy by taking a bunch of people who are all equally sick, and then they test them for the pathogen of interest. And if the vaccinated people test negative more often, even though they're equally sick, that is the estimate of vaccine efficacy. Right. And so I saw this pop up in studies multiple times, and I wanted to write something about the vaccine efficacy against the Omicron variant. And I run into this again. I'm like, here we go again with another one of these test negative case control studies. This design makes no sense to me. It's really weird. Let me look into critiques of the design. So I go on PubMed, and rather than finding a critique, I find something by Mark Lipich's group, who he's very kind of high level researcher in this area of vaccine efficacy. And I just find a review of it, and they are not really critiquing it. If anything, Mark Lipich's critique of test negative case control studies is that they tend to underestimate vaccine efficacy, and they never mention the fact that all these people are equally sick. Right. So anyway, I read this review and I find that they collected 490 test negative case control studies since 1980. 90% of observational vaccine efficacy studies since 2011 have had this design. And four of them cited in the paper were polio. And they mentioned that all the people in the study were paralyzed. And so I'm like, this, because I'm thinking of writing this post called Test Negative Case Control Studies Are a Scam. And I'm like, okay, I have to look at the original papers to see if this is as irredeemably corrupt as it sounds. And sure enough, these papers, everyone in the paper is paralyzed, right? So they're all equally paralyzed. And then if the vaccinated ones are more likely to have a negative stool test for polio, the vaccine was effective. And so it just sort of underscores the point that that modern medicine has no interest in making you healthy. It just wants you to test negative for specific pathogens.
I'm curious if you found any double-blind studies on the MMR vaccine or any other vaccinations, classic double-blind studies.
Yeah, I haven't looked into that one. My understanding from hearing Kennedy talk about it, and I think a lot of people misunderstand him, because a lot of people shoot back like, well, there's tons of double-blind randomized studies on this stuff. I think what he's been saying is that there aren't any that use inert placebos. So like a saline placebo instead of a meningococcal placebo seen as a placebo, and so all the side effect rates are artificially inflated. I mean, if the observational studies are gone with test negative case control studies, and it's true that all the RCTs on all the traditional vaccines are meningococcal controls or something like that, then that's the entire body of vaccine efficacy research.
That is. Other people are like, what are you talking about right now? This is probably kind of sounding weird, but it basically means that they don't do a shot study where they put one person with a fake shot that there's nothing in it. It's just water. And the other person gets the real one. And then we don't compare it 10 years later to see, oh, did this person end up, gravely ill? What happened? That doesn't exist. They study it. They do plenty of studies, but they don't do the classic double-blind study that we think of.
Yeah. And so one thing that struck me when I was looking at the trials is that most of them did use saline placebos, but the one that was done on AstraZeneca used a meningococcal vaccine. And I'm like, that's really weird. Why does that stand out?
Right.
Then I went and saw Del Bigtree speak, and he claims, and I didn't fact check this, but he says that all the trials were going to use the meningococcal vaccine, but Del Bigtree himself or his organization, ICANN, threatened the FDA that if they did, they would globally publicize the trials as shams unless they changed it to a saline placebo. And all the ones that were done in American companies changed it to a saline placebo, which was why AstraZeneca was left over as the kind of outlier. So I thought that was quite interesting. But
it is.
All right,
I hope it's true. We'll find out.
Yeah. All right. So I guess let's talk. I mean, I guess just to set the foundation. So let's talk a little bit about the ethics of vaccine mandates, and then let's get into strategy, because I think you and I are totally agreed on opposition to them. But there are, I think, some common. I think we should try to dialogue with the people who are in favor of them. Steelman the argument, so to speak. And so, I think part of this comes down to, and we come from libertarian backgrounds, so one of the critiques of libertarianism in general would be that there are economic externalities, and so if there are things that are shared in common, like the air, you can divvy up land all you want, you could try to divvy up the ocean water, although that's quite fluid, but the air, even if you own the air outside your house, it's different air by the time 3 seconds have gone by. And so I think the argument, and please add to this if you can steelman it any better than I can, but I think the argument in favor of vaccine mandates is, you are breathing into the air and you are affecting your fellow human beings around you, and you should, your bodily autonomy ends when your germs are destined and inevitable to get on the next person, because now you are infringing on their bodily autonomy. And so if we all have a right to our own bodies and a right to be healthy, you don't have the right to be so irresponsible with your body that you are infecting mine. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's the argument. It's a positive rights argument. I think that it assumes that you're sick. It assumes that you're the one who's going to make someone else sick. And it assumes that that can be tracked, which I can tell you from a litigation perspective, it's almost impossible to win a case on toxic mold. If someone lives in a rental home that is infested with toxic mold, they become gravely ill, nearly die, and their life is ruined, it is almost impossible to win that at trial. Very frustrating. And so to think that you're going to prove that someone walking around breathing the same air as you also made you gravely ill is laughable from a legal perspective. And I try not to laugh at people on this topic because I understand that emotions are high and people are really frightened, but it's not a good argument. It's just not. So, I mean, if I'm arguing for it, I hear that and I say, well, that's exactly the problem. The fact that it's so hard to prove in court, and yet we know that there are toxic mold cases. This is exactly why we need environmental regulations to control the probability that what's released into the air is going to make other people sick. And therefore, we also need, vaccine mandates are essentially a type of environmental regulation. They are.
Where we say, we might not be able to prove in a court case that your germ made me sick, but we need you to follow regulations that are going to reduce the probability that there will be enough germs in the air to make everyone else sick around you. What would you say to that?
I feel like that is a pretty long discussion to be had, but we need to get into, at that point, how do you know it was me? Can you prove it was me? Even contact tracing has kind of failed in other countries that have tried it. At that point, now we're arguing past vaccine mandates and we're just going into permanent lockdowns, because we've all discovered recently, and even mainstream news can't hide it, that getting vaccinated doesn't make you, it doesn't provide you immunity. They're now telling us that it makes you less sick, or it decreases your chances of hospitalization. So I would say I'm not really sure what the point would be of a vaccine mandate if mandating it and doesn't even keep you safe. We had aggressive lockdowns in New York City and LA, and that also didn't seem to slow the spread.
Yeah, it's hard to say what would be in a permanent, an alternative universe, but certainly the fatalities in New York mostly happened during lockdown. Like, most of the fatalities from in the last 2 years did happen in the first wave. And although that's so hard to separate from the fact that Cuomo was sending all the infected elderly into the nursing homes.
It is really, yeah.
So
it is really hard.
How much of this for you comes down to moral absolute principle, and how much comes down to a utilitarian argument? Because the evidence around whether the vaccine reduces transmission is completely utilitarian in nature. So that sort of leaves open the door that if you could prove that the vaccine mandate was uniquely able to reduce transmission in a way that these others couldn't, then the utilitarian argument in favor of it would carry the day. But we can't prove that. And in fact, the evidence just looks like it's not that great at reducing transmission. It's getting worse and worse as each new variant comes along. There's all these other things we can do to reduce transmission. So why are we singling out vaccines? So, but that, that in an alternative pandemic could be wrong. Like we could have something that is so transmissible. In theory, right? It's hypothetically, we could have something that is so transmissible that you can isolate in a bubble and somehow it's able to escape from the bubble and rapidly transmit to everyone around you. And yet somehow we've developed a vaccine that's 100% effective against infection. And so the vaccine is the one unique way that you could reduce transmission. Taking that case to the limit, would you say the utilitarian argument would carry the case in favor of the vaccine mandate there, or do you have other principles against vaccine mandates that even in that case, the utilitarian argument would not be sufficient?
Well, if it's effective, if a hypothetical vaccine is effective against a deadly, highly contagious pathogen, then anybody who gets vaccinated doesn't have to worry about it. Only the people who refuse to get vaccinated are going to be the ones at risk. So I wouldn't think that you would need to mandate that. I also would think that if you've got something like the bubonic plague or Ebola that's airborne and rapidly transmissible, everyone is going to go out and do everything they possibly can to avoid it. No one wants to bleed out of their eyes and their face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I personally, I feel like I believe in a complete, absolute moral autonomy over our own bodies. And I'm forced to try to grapple with, can you stand up for that in the extreme scenario? And I think like you, I think we think commonly on this, that, if, the reason people are lax around, if anything, they're more cautious than they should be, more afraid than they should be. Mm-hmm. I think that's a product of the media, messaging. But I think that people become more and more lax over time because they realize that they're probably not going to die because they went to the coffee shop. And so if it was incredibly clear that you would probably die if you went to the coffee shop, you're not going to go to the coffee shop.
Correct.
And if you really want to die, that should be your choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. If I see some natural disaster outside, I'm not like, I think I'm just going to go walk into that and die. That's usually not my reaction. There are people who are paid to go out and deal with that sort of stuff professionally, but generally I make my own risk assessment. Okay, I'm going to get out and drive my car today. Small percentage chance that I could get in an accident and die, but I really need to go to the grocery store. Like, we all deal with these cost-benefit analysis every single day, every waking moment of our lives. You could walk down the street, trip and fall, crack your head, and then that's the end. But we're not all consumed by that, because you have to just get out and live your life. And I think that with that was like grossly disproportionate when it first started, and now it's starting to become more in alignment with how we would behave, just like normally, just dealing with any other kind of germ or threat.
Since you brought up driving, I have to ask, I get this. I feel like just ignoring it when it comes my way. But, well, we make people wear seatbelts.
Yep.
What would be your response to that?
There was this interesting, I'm trying to remember when it was, if it was World War I or World War II. There was this thing with flak jackets. So everybody who's in the plane in the war is made to wear a flak jacket because you're more likely to die from gunfire than your plane going down. But there are always about 20% of people who are like, I don't want a flak jacket. I want a parachute because if the plane goes down, I want to have people have just different cost benefit analysis. And I think it's the same thing with seatbelts because there's always some random story, although it's unlikely, but it's out there of someone who didn't have their seatbelt and they were in an accident and they were thrown out of the car to safety and the car exploded in flames or crumpled, it's weird stuff. And I think that generally, statistically speaking, those things sort of shake out on their own. So I wear a seatbelt, but there are occasions when I don't, like if I'm backing my car up 10 feet. And I think it's stupid to be ticketed for that.
So you're against seatbelt mandates too?
I am against seatbelt mandates. I think that most people who want to wear seatbelts, they're going to do it. And the handful of people that don't, if you're killed in a horrible accident and that hits the news, that's pretty good cautionary tale to the rest of us.
I wonder how many people actually get ticketed for not wearing a seatbelt. It seems like I never hear of this happening, and I'm sure it does happen, but it's got to be that the numbers are pretty low and they're pulled over for some other reason.
I don't know. I remember my mother getting a seatbelt ticket when we were little. We were pulling out of the grocery store parking lot. She was putting it on, and they pulled her over, and they were like, "You should have put it on as soon as you started the car." Ticket. Take it, Mom.
Sounds like they were low on their quota.
Right. Just stupid, right? Like stupid. We're going 0 miles an hour, maybe 3 miles an hour, and she's like this, and they're like, "Gotcha."
Yeah. All right. So let's get into strategy a little bit. So we're going to assume that anyone following along with this conversation agrees with us that we want to get rid of these vaccine mandates. It's looking pretty bleak in New York. It seems like there's just kind of this weird bifurcation between don't ask, don't tell in a large, I don't know if it's minority or slight majority or something of institutions. But certainly the places with the big names and the places that run artistic shows and stuff like that, or run by the city are all, checking papers. And now we have people regularly getting arrested for restaurant sit-ins. Seems like multiple times a week right now.
Yep.
What are we going to do about this?
Okay, so here's what we got to do. We've had one meeting about it. We're talking about amending the city charter through an initiative to get rid of these things and to ban them. In a nutshell. And it definitely requires some work, but it requires less signatures than the Los Angeles City Initiative process. So that makes me pretty optimistic.
Are you doing the same thing in LA?
Oh yeah, we're underway in LA.
And so can you talk a little bit more, elaborate a little bit about this? The city charter would be amended to prevent what exactly?
To prohibit checking proof of vaccination. And then we're getting into sort of the nitty gritty of this, like how many things we're going to ban. We're actually going to have another call about it tomorrow. So do we want to also ban contact tracing? Are we doing this just for public places? Are we doing it just for city employees?
Who is we? Who's we?
The people drafting the initiative. So there's a group of New Yorkers, and I've sort of kind of gathered a handful of them together and said, this is what I did in LA. I think you guys can do the same thing. So I'm kind of just helping them get it off the ground and understand the process, and then they're just going to take it and run.
Okay. And, I wonder, it seems like if you ban something specific, there will be sort of like infinite loopholes. So how do we think about what to ban? Because I'm thinking,
right.
I'm thinking like, does the mayor really need to have pandemic emergency powers, generally speaking?
Correct. So we also have to deal with that. And so, there's a lot of things to consider. So does he have emergency powers? How long should those be able to go into effect? Can he continue to renew them in perpetuity? How do we put the brakes on that? What do we do if the governor says XYZ and the city defies it? Like, how do we identify legislative loopholes that are to our benefit? And how do we identify legislative loopholes that are not to our benefit? And how do we work all of that together? So it sounds like a daunting process, but it's really not. What we do is basically just like an aggressive decision tree chart. If this, then that. We map out all of the possibilities, and then we're like, okay, so we'll draft something that covers all of it. Then we submit it for approval, argue with the city, we go back and forth. Finally, it'll get approved, and then it'll be on a ballot at the next general election.
So that's an approval to get a referendum on it. Yep.
Yes.
And
but there's nothing.
So when would that be voted on if it went as fast as possible?
Well, when is the next general election? In New York City. That's when it'll be voted on.
Well, we just is general election. Is that a mayoral election, or is that
could be mayoral? Could be city council.
We just elected the mayor.
Right.
But so it could be next November.
Could be. Whatever is going to be on the ballot next. It doesn't have to be mayor. Whatever's going to be on the ballot.
It doesn't have to be one of the big ones.
And then it's a percentage, the number of people that you need to get signed to sign the initiative to get it on the ballot is a percentage of people who voted in the last mayoral election. And I don't remember the exact number, but I believe it was around 30 to 40,000 signatures, which is less than what I need in LA. And out of 4 million people, no, you have like 8 million people in your city. That's not difficult to meet.
Did you just say 30 or 40,000 people voted in the last election?
Oh, no. That's just the percentage it's a small percentage of the people who voted.
30 or 40%?
30 to 40,000
it's some percentage that you don't remember that equates to about 30 to 40,000 people. I see.
That's correct.
So, I mean, what is your optimism for this passing? Do you feel like if this was, let's say that we did no work to change the hearts and minds of New Yorkers, do you think, given what people think now, that this would pass?
Oh, you got to change the hearts and minds of New Yorkers. I don't know what it would be like right now. It would really depend on who shows up at the polls to vote on it. But if you continue to have people doing sit-ins, peaceful protests that actually generate news, like children getting thrown out of Applebee's, if you continue to do that sort of stuff the entire time, there's I think a very good chance that it'll pass because people will just be sick of it. And also, what does it mean to be fully vaccinated? Because the goalposts are going to constantly change over the next year. And then Pfizer is putting out Pfizer. They're going to have this pill, right? So that also, even though I'm not, real crazy about it, that's going to be another chink in the vaccine mandate armor. So you've got all of these things kind of bubbling up and happening and disrupting their narrative. I do think there's a good chance that it'll pass. One of the other things. Go ahead.
I don't. It's hard for me to really. Certainly, there's no good data on it, but it's hard for me to wrap my mind around what the majority of people think. But I think the best way to do that is just to look at the proportion of people who were vaccinated in August and assume that is an overestimate of the people who support mandates.
Correct.
And so, if that was like, I forget exactly what the number was, but it was somewhere around 50%. It wasn't that high. And actually, there was some news that came out that the CDC had been overestimating vaccination rates too. I don't know if the New York City was doing the same. But, presumably not everyone presumably some of the people who got vaccinated in the first half of the year regret it now.
Yeah.
Some of the people who got vaccinated in the first half of the year think it's the right choice, but don't want it mandated for other people. And then, the rest of those people basically might support the mandates. But I feel like anyone who got vaccinated mid-August forward was doing it under duress. I mean, if you spent 6 months not getting vaccinated and then all of a sudden you got vaccinated when they were threatening you to lose your job, then you probably hate and resent the mandate.
Yes.
So it's got to be roughly half the population, I would think. And yet, if we just had a mayoral election, the next election is going to have pathetic voter turnout, and so it seems like it's going to come down to just who we motivate to get out and vote. I don't know if that makes it easier or harder. What do you think about that?
I think it makes it easier because the people who are really passionate about this issue are going to show up to vote. Voter turnout is not, we had, I guess, historic voter turnout in 2020. But voter turnout does not generally represent the entire population. Not everybody votes. And it's not because everybody is like a libertarian and an anarchist. It's because a lot of people are just ambivalent about politics. They hate it. They don't care. They're just literally too busy and don't have the time to go to the polls. So, whether or not you agree with that, it is what it is. And so we might as well use that to our advantage in this particular circumstance.
Do you think that this model of modifying city charters, do you think that that is what should be the primary focus on other stages, for example, state stages or national stages? Do you think that, and how would you compare that to voting for the right people? Do you think we should do both, or how would you see that?
I think this is easier. I think that single issue coalitions are really important for like rights-based campaigns because you can reach people across party lines where otherwise they're not going to agree on the same candidate. So there are going to be a lot of Green Party people, some kind of socialist, communist-y people who are just like, they oppose mandates, they hate them, they hate big pharma, whatever their reasonings are, and they're going to vote to turn these things over. A lot of black people are highly skeptical of this kind of stuff because they have been screwed over in the past by government experimentation. So they're very skeptical of vaccination, and they have a right to be, in my opinion. So you'll get people across different ideological lines. I think this is a much easier way to do it. Another really good thing that has come out of the efforts in LA is that as soon as I got the ball rolling on this and started sending the paperwork in and the city attorney's office was reviewing it, within like a week, the city attorney's office started making announcements about how they were going to carve out more exceptions. And we have been basically chiseling away at this stupid mandate in the city of LA because they know that they're facing really strong opposition.
So that's good. You're basically taking that as an index that they're afraid of your city charter approach.
Yes. So that's really good. And we have, I don't know if you probably have it maybe for boroughs. In LA, the city is so large that we have city council and then we have neighborhood councils. And a small percentage of neighborhood councils have come out very strongly against this as well. So not everybody is, united behind this, even in the political scene.
Yeah, I'm not sure how New York is organized in that way. I know we have borough governments and community boards, but I don't know what power they have. So my kind of view of this, actually, one thing I want to say is I actually have a lot of hope in the referendum process in New York because in the last election, there was, I was giving maybe a 10% chance to the possibility that that Sliwa, the Republican, would, because he had basically last minute taken the vaccine mandate as his cause, when he realized that he might just be able to throw together the right coalition between, the public workers and this and that and whatever. And that was probably right. He wound up getting more than expected in like 20-something% of the vote. But it was pretty clear that Adams, was almost certainly going to be the next mayor. And some of the referendums, though, there were referendums that were like clearly designed to make the election easier to steal. And, they were like getting rid of, getting rid of the 10-day requirement to register and then getting rid of any requirement for mail-in ballots. It was, you just look at it and you're like, oh my God, this is, why would you make those referendums unless you wanted to steal the next election? Yeah. And I was a bit afraid that New Yorkers are just so of single mind on this issue that everyone's going to vote for the Democrat. Everyone's going to vote the wrong way on the referendums. But sure enough, Adams won in a landslide. And yet I believe those referendums lost. And so many people made the choice to vote in an intelligent way on the referendums, despite just sort of going the way that you knew
Yes.
they would on the candidate. So do you then, I mean, what's your view of, by the way, do you live in California now?
Yeah.
And you have are you trying to move, or you're committed to your
I
state?
have to see through the initiative before I consider moving. It's on the table, but I'm like very focused on my due diligence in the city of Los Angeles, at least for the next 4 months.
So there's a lot of people who, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of people who just say like, bro, why are you still living in New York? And there's obviously a lot of people that have moved to Texas and Florida for political reasons. And there are some people who hold that up not just as a means of protecting yourself, but also as a means of political action by voting with your feet.
Yes.
What's your take on that? What's your take on the idea that that's effective political action?
I think it is effective political action. And I certainly don't shame or blame anyone for leaving California or New York. Like, they've become hellhole states. It sucks. It's like a failed state. But the reason that I haven't just like bowed out yet is because Los Angeles and New York City are the epicenters of culture, and culture flows out from them, and it infects and impacts the rest of the country. And I think that it's really important to try to make a final last stand in these places so that we can protect the rest of the country. Because when these places collapse, to whatever extent they're going to collapse, the people who voted those policies in, who made them awful, they end up moving and going to other places in the country, and they take their bad policies with them, which is terrible. So it's kind of weird, but I almost want to protect LA so that the bad people stay there and they don't go out and ruin Florida and South Dakota and wherever else it is.
Over a 5 or 10 year time horizon, would you predict that Texas and Florida would continue to be anti-lockdown, anti-mandate bastions of political freedom?
Florida, yes. I don't know about Texas. It's been, invaded by people with bad ideology.
So you're thinking, the liberals moved from California to Austin. They
do. Yeah. I know a lot of them that do.
Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. I see people all the time on social media, flip Texas blue. Let's flip it blue.
And why do you put so much trust in Florida?
I think that the government in Florida is much more dedicated to keeping it freer. That Greg Abbott, Texas governor, I appreciate that he flipped and opened Texas up, but he did it later under political pressure. I think because he had an election coming up.
Later than DeSantis, you mean?
Yes,
right?
He was later than DeSantis. So, I don't think that he is as, how do I say this without sounding bad? I don't think that he's motivated by principle as much as he is by election results. And I think that DeSantis is more doing this on principle, and that's going to attract people who are more strongly, who have stronger feelings about it. And it's also pushing out people who don't like that, people who do want to be locked down.
Do you think DeSantis is positioning himself for the national stage in the next presidential election?
Man, I think it's possible, but I hope not, because I think he should stay the governor of Florida because he's doing a great job. And it would, it would be tragic if Florida succumbed and had someone who was less good on lockdowns and vaccine passports.
So then, I mean, how would you modify your view of like the 5 to 10 year probability for Florida if we think there's a 50% chance that DeSantis is going to run for president or vice president?
It's gonna depend, I think, on his actions, and if he were to run, it would depend on who was elected next. They're going to have to keep the people there, the people in leadership, really strongly opposed to this stuff. I do feel like they've set a good trend, though, and there's a precedent and there's a pressure on them to continue with their policies. So, I hope that it stays that way.
I mean,
Texas, I just don't think Texas is positioned in the same way. It's not uniquely positioned.
That seems like kind of a black box, who it would be elected next. So, I mean, what that makes me think of is that, say you could imagine a scenario where the candidates in New York and LA are as pro-lockdown, pro-mandate as they get, and yet the city charter referendums are successful. Meanwhile, DeSantis is, as anti-mandate, anti-lockdown as you can get in a governor, and he leaves Florida. Someone worse takes over, and then all of a sudden, 10 years from now, New York or LA looks better than Florida. Would you consider that within the realm of possible scenarios?
I don't think so. I think that's a little further, stretched. I could just see Florida just becoming more like Texas, not as good. I don't ever see it becoming like as bad as New York or Florida, or as bad as New York or LA, at least not in the next 5 years.
Is that because of the voters, or is that because of something else?
I think it's the voters. I think it's the general demographic and the vibe. And it's attracted a lot of people who are very anti-mandate too, which is a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do wonder if the idea that you can just move to Texas or Florida, first of all, I agree with what you were saying before, and I think it's super important to protect the cities that look like they're about to fall. I like to think of totalitarianism as a virus, and New York is the country's nose. And the last thing you want is for your immune system to run away if you have an infection that came into your nose, because then it's just going to, you're going to get sepsis, right?
Right.
If you have no immune system. And, another way you could think of is I think they're just beta testing this stuff in the big cities. And like you were saying, if they succeed, they're going to move on to conquer the next territory. So I really like your approach about the charter amendment, because I feel like that doesn't require putting trust in anyone.
Correct.
If you put if the whole foundation for why Florida is attractive from that perspective is because you put your trust in DeSantis, and it only takes DeSantis to be gone for the tables to really turn. Whereas if you get down into the constitutions and charters of the cities and states, then I think you've protected them in a way that does not depend on the personalities involved. It doesn't even depend on the voters, right?
Right.
New York City can continue to have the largest number of pro-lockdown voters. And if enough people turned out to prevent the mayor from implementing them, then next time around, it doesn't even matter.
Exactly.
The candidates and the voters are screwed, but the charter protects everyone.
Yes.
So I think that really is a genius approach. You were saying that we really need to change the hearts and minds of people. I mean, could you outline what you think are the top 5 things that need to be done to change the hearts and minds of the people in these big cities in the next year? Yeah, absolutely. So you've got to connect with people on an emotional human level. We can throw stats and data and all of that stuff at them, lists of side effects till we're blue in the face, but they're emotionally invested in their own perspective and opinion. So it's either we're conspiracy theorists, or they're just going to shut us out because they're like, oh, I don't like thinking about that. That makes me feel uncomfortable. I reject cognitive dissonance. No, I'm right. You've got to really be able to pierce that. And the best way to do that is through emotional appeal. And sometimes I say you've got to attack the left from the left. 67% of LA's Black population is unvaccinated. You're going to look me in the eye and tell me that you're going to keep the majority of Black people out of your restaurant? You're going to put them at a different water fountain? That's sick. No one's going to say that. That's the sort of stuff we got to drill home. You want to tell me that it's okay to make a cost-benefit analysis that a certain percentage of children have to die from vaccine injuries so that the rest of us, so that senior citizens can live? No one wants to be that guy. No one wants to wave that flag. And when you start telling people very real life stories and putting a name to a face, this girl died, this boy he's in the hospital with heart inflammation, he'll never be able to play football, he'll never be in Little League, he's going to be dependent on his parents for his entire life, you've ruined this family's life. That's the sort of stuff where people are like, oh, and it starts to kind of chip away at that hardened shell. That's what we've got to do, I think. And how do we tell those stories? It's hard to get into the media. So is this something we've got to be handing pamphlets out about, or doing, talking about on podcasts, interviewing? Should I be interviewing vaccine-injured children on my podcast? Like, how do we tell those stories?
You can. I think one of the things that I think is incredibly effective is public comment at city council meetings. And if you have borough council meetings or anything of that sort, do it. You usually get 1 to 3 minutes. You want to practice it. You want to talk about it. Do like whatever, rehearse your talking points and go and do it. And then everybody who's on that meeting, including reporters, has to listen to you. They hear you. That's what I've done in LA to get the initiative going. And within a matter of weeks, I had LA Times reporters calling me. Like I didn't have to send press releases anymore. I'm just giving public comment.
So you think the reporters themselves are vulnerable to feeling that emotional connection?
Yes.
Is that right?
It takes time. It takes time, but it can be done. So generally in like an election, for example, it takes an average of 8 interactions for someone to even notice you and remember you. So you think you need to make 8 interactions to make a permanent impression in someone's mind. And that's what we did in LA, at least to get the initiative going. And once we're set to collect signatures, which is going to be happening in a couple weeks, there have been some delays because of the city. Once we do that, then we're going to start hitting public comment again with all the sob stories and the horror stories and talking about the statistics with keeping Black people out and how we don't oppose that, or how we do oppose that, how we oppose segregation, that sort of stuff. It is going to start to make people reconsider. Even if they don't want to admit it publicly, like I'll start with cognitive dissonance. I'll accept that. So
public comment at committee meetings and council meetings is something I've not even heard come up. I think all of us in New York have been kind of struggling to figure out what is the right thing to do because we weren't organized for this. Like right. there's no organized health freedom movement that stretches back decades or centuries of tradition in New York, and everything's people are just kind of congealing in reaction to this, being like, well, what do I do? And so we've got street protests and marches and things like that. More commonly now, these sit-ins. What impact do you think things like that have emotionally? Like what do you think the impact is of someone seeing marches either going down the street or in the news, the way the news talks about them? And do you think there are any, and I guess bundled up in this, I would like also your political view on the private property rights of these restaurants who should have the free choice to obey the city's mandate. I guess, could you talk about that from the political perspective, but also what impressions are we making as you're seeing them with these things?
Okay, so let's do private property first. No, let's do protests and then private property.
Okay.
So I think that protests and rallies do not change the hearts and minds of people who are opposed to you, but they do serve a good purpose, and that's to show other people who believe the same thing as you that they're not alone. Because I have found that there are actually a lot of people who oppose these mandates, or people who got one shot and resented it, and they're surrounded by friends and family who are hardcore pro-lockdown, pro-mandate, and they feel totally isolated and alone. And when they're driving down the street and they see that there's hundreds of people who are rallying and they have the same views, they're emboldened. They're like, okay, I'm going to do that too. And then they'll start speaking out and they'll start talking to the people around them. So I think that is the role that protests have. It also does get you earned media, which is something that we need to work on probably in New York City, is how to get the press coming to you. That's really important. They'll definitely cover things, like a 5-year-old being thrown out of Applebee's, and I'm glad that they do, but I want them to cover more than that. And that's kind of what we've developed in LA. Private property.
So here we have both a political angle, right? As a libertarian, I'm wondering how you think of that politically, but then we also have, what impression does this make? Because I know that it has diverse impressions, or bifurcated binary set of impressions based on just posting about it in social media. There are, and it does divide some people who are generally against the mandates, where there are people who just think these people are heroes because they're willing to risk getting arrested for this.
Yeah.
And then there are other people that are like, why are you hassling these people who are basically victims of the lockdown? So what's your take on both the political angle and on, is that sending the right impression to people?
So I think that we need to encourage as many businesses as possible to stand up against this stuff. And I know that it's a risk, and I encourage them to make that risk because it is very important. And, their businesses are going to be suffering because of this too, because this just means less people who can go in and patronize them and spend money there. I won't shill for private property mandates. Yes, a business can technically do what it wants. I think that a business should be able to do that. But I'm not going to advocate for them to do something that I think is a poor, immoral decision. Just like I'm not going to advocate for businesses to exclude people based on race. As a libertarian, yeah, I think you should technically be able to do that, but I still think it's a stupid thing and you shouldn't do it. Like, that's a bad idea. I think that you should also, I think the drug war should be decriminalized.
Let me pause on that question right there. So let's imagine that much of the legislation from the civil rights movement had not passed, and you legally could discriminate based on race. What do you think the world would look like now? Do you think a lot of people would be discriminating based on race? Or do you think the stupidity of that would be exposed in other ways, and how, I guess?
I think by now the stupidity of that would have been exposed in other ways. I don't think that we would be living in a world that was racially segregated. Yeah.
And
definitely.
Do you think part of that would just be through, before they were doing that, there were sit-ins, right? So
yes.
If, without trying to comment on whether there's moral equivalence between vaccine mandates and that stuff, that I think is neither here nor there, but there's obviously very clear political analogy between doing a sit-in based on one type of discrimination versus another. Do you think that the sit-ins would have been the primary mechanism to convince people of the stupidity of that? How do you think that would have played out? Because I think that helps us think about the mandates.
Yeah, sit-ins, boycotts, information campaigns, all of it. Like every type of activism that you can do, I think is really important. And then if there are other bad laws that are basically used as evidence or to prop up discrimination, that also needs to be removed. So, like, if there were laws dictating that people have to be segregated in certain weird ways, or like the marriage law saying that you couldn't marry someone from another, ethnicity, race. I don't even like to use the word race. It's the human race,
Uh-huh.
Get rid of all of those. Like, and so for us, like with scenes, like we need to have more transparency on what's in them and side effects. I would love to see that Supreme Court decision reversed. I don't know if we're going to get to that, but these companies should have liability.
You want to, what decision?
Bruce Woods v. Wyeth, and the one that came before it. Basically, the Supreme Court decision that said that vaccine manufacturers have no liability for vaccine injuries.
That was upholding the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, correct.
All right. So back to these mandates, the sit-ins specifically. I guess what you're saying is that, well, this is a weird situation, right? Because we kind of have, the free choice that these restaurants are making in the city is to comply with the mandate so that they don't
it's not
fined.
A free choice. They're being coerced. It's not a free choice. They're being coerced.
Yeah. So it's sort of, clearly there must be less virtue even, or vice or whatever. I don't know. If it was a virtuous choice, there would not be that much virtue in it because they're just trying to not get fined.
Right.
But if it's a vice, I think they compound each other because they are both doing the wrong thing and doing it sheerly out of cowardice.
Right.
So I guess I guess for the morality of the private property here, is it that they should have the right to make a bad choice with their property, but we should have the right to violate their property and get arrested for it? What are the moral rights involved in the sit-in?
I mean, I don't know if I would frame it as rights.
How would you frame it? Yeah.
Like they have, the law should be removed. And since it's not, we're all operating under a framework of tyranny, and we've got to do what's best for us. And I think that peaceful demonstrations and trying to go into their restaurants peacefully is fine. I would definitely condemn any property damage. Like, please don't go in and vandalize any place, But, and if they call the cops on you, you're going to get arrested, and you just have to sort of own up to that.
So let's lay out and frame properly how we think about these restaurant sit-ins that are happening in New York City. I think there's two components to that. One is how we think about the legal and ethical framework, because a lot of people will debate whether, who is infringing on whose rights. And then the other part is, you had mentioned before that it's really important that we make the right impression on people in order to win over the hearts and minds of the populace, especially as we go forward for something like amending the city charter, where we're depending on the people to agree with us to vote in the referendum. So let's do those one at a time, and I guess start with the ethical and legal framework around it. A lot of people who are not libertarians would look at this and say, you're violating these people's property rights, and they might not be very consistent about how they defend property rights, but that's what they would say in that scenario. But I think a lot of libertarians would look at this and say, start from the non-aggression principle and say, this person has a right to determine what happens with their property, and if they want to obey the mayor's mandate, however questionable the mayor's mandate may be from a legal perspective, that's their property. So how would you frame what's going on with property rights to participate in society? Like who has what rights in that situation?
So I think that something that's really important to understand in this context is that the majority of restaurants are enforcing these measures because of laws and also because of government propaganda. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the CDC totally flip things around, change what they're saying, change recommendations. All the laws have changed. Everything is a moving goalpost. And restaurants are kind of like, they don't know what to do. They're sort of stuck with it. A lot of people are just thinking that whatever the government says must be true, and that's why they're doing it. It's not even so personal. Just like obedience. And I think it's okay to go into a restaurant and try to persuade someone, please let me eat here, as long as you're not doing property damage. Doing property damage and, actively trying to drive out other customers, that's different. I feel like the discomfort that you would make for other people in the restaurant is a little bit of a gray area. And so you should use your best judgment. Like, don't harass customers, just try and go and do your thing. But at a certain point, we've got to try to change people's minds. And the best way to do that is usually to confront people face to face. So that's kind of my baseline.
Right. So I think one way to think about this is that this is a form of civil disobedience. And I think people who think about civil disobedience at least from the variety of, peaceful, nonviolent, civil disobedience, the traditional way to think about civil disobedience is that there is a law, you are breaking the law, you are openly breaking the law, you are openly breaking the law because of some moral conviction, and you are willingly accepting whatever the consequences of breaking that law are. Now, we can question whether there is any law here at all, with the mayor's mandate, but in this case, there's the analogy, I think, and let me, I guess respond to how I'm thinking about this. The way that I would think about it is, yes, the owner of the restaurant has the right to determine what goes on in that restaurant, who can be there and whatnot. But in this case, we have a severe ethical dilemma. Things are wrong. And so as a means of persuasion, we are engaging in civil disobedience knowingly and accepting whatever the consequences of that are, which are to get arrested, obey the police whenever they arrest you, then go to court, then argue your case in court. And so the restaurant has the right to say they're obeying the mandate because they want to, and other people have a right to do a sit-in and accept the consequences of that. Would you see it that way as well?
Yeah, I think that this is a situation where you have to assume the risk. And one of the things that we did in LA when everything was locked down was we got a big list of restaurants. We got actually the list of every restaurant in LA County. And we started calling people, and we just did call banking. And we called them and we're like, hey, can we convince you to open? What do you need? What kind of support do you need? Under what conditions would you open? Would you do it secretly? Are you willing to be defiant? Do you need help? We can't guarantee that we won't get you in legal trouble, but we can get you pro bono legal assistance, things like that. And I think that's also a good approach to take in this. And maybe we would back up and try that first. But that also gave us a really good sense of where businesses were at. And most of them felt just absolutely strangled and fed up. And they were very frustrated, and they were only complying with this stuff because they didn't want to lose their licenses. They didn't want the social pressure either. That was something that was frustrating, but not everyone. A lot of people were really fed up, and they were like, hey, if you'll send me customers secretly, I'll serve them. So I think it's important to take sort of a temperature test of the restaurants that you're working with.
And what proportion would you say in LA were, going against the mandate in some capacity as a result of you calling them? And what happened with that? I'm not really familiar with the situation in LA as I am in New York. So what's going on there now? And
what percentage? I would say it was a small percentage of businesses that were willing to risk it. Maybe 10% of the ones that we reached out to. But we didn't receive angry pushback, if that makes sense. Yeah. People weren't like, oh, stop calling me, you psycho. People were more fearful. They were afraid of what would happen to them.
Right.
But not everyone. And as people became more desperate financially, they became much more willing to break the rules and take a risk. Because a lot of these places, and the same goes with vaccine mandates, a lot of these places are being hit really hard because they're having less business.
So was that call banking about opening during lockdown, or was
Yes.
it about, okay. And so now what's the situation in LA? Is there a vaccine mandate similar to New York for restaurants?
Yes, there is. And we will be
doing similar.
Yeah, we'll be starting up on that probably within the next couple of weeks. We've already got a little bit. There is a little bit, but an aggressive push will be happening in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. Well, that's quite, let's, kind of go to the second part of this, which is how we're influencing the hearts and minds. And obviously there are both, the hearts and minds of the business owners, hearts and minds of the customers in the business, and in the hearts and minds of everyone that's seeing it on TV when Jimmy Fallon's making fun of them, or when it winds up on Laura Ingraham on Fox News or wherever it happens. So, it sounds to me like the business owners certainly they're going to react much more favorably to you calling them and offering support. Maybe they would react a little bit more favorably to the sit-in if they'd gotten that call first. I'm not sure.
Right.
Maybe some of them would.
It depends. Chain restaurants, there was a lot of drama over a particular chain restaurant. I feel like those are financially they're the easiest, or they're probably in a better financial spot than a small mom and pop business. So they have less to lose with all of this stuff going on.
And so what do you think the impact is of these sit-ins? Just, the ones in New York City have gotten national attention. What's your read on whether it's a positive or negative press?
I think it's positive. I think it's positive because there are a lot of people who feel the same way we do. They do not support vaccine mandates, but they're afraid to speak out. They're not sure what to do about it. They're not surrounded by other people who are supportive of their views. And so these national headlines really show other people like, hey, you're not alone. There are a lot of people who are fed up over it, and they're willing to go to pretty great lengths to make a point. I think that's good.
Then, yeah, well, now that you phrase it that way, that it seems like you're placing the impact of that very similar to the protests, that this is raising awareness that there is a resistance that you can join.
Yes.
And in that case, it seems like the sit-ins are much more powerful than the rallies because they, 5 people getting arrested at Cheesecake Factory can make national news.
Yes.
Whereas we can have, 10,000 people marching across the Brooklyn Bridge and it'll get some press, but it's not going to get national news.
It's
doesn't
because
make Jimmy Fallon doesn't,
you got to have skin in the game.
Yeah.
You got to demonstrate to people like this is so important that I'm willing to make a serious risk over it. I'm willing to get incarcerated. I'm willing to have a criminal record. I'm willing to lose my job. Once you send that message, people will pay attention.
Yeah, and I thought it was really powerful that there was an Army veteran who had made a statement about how he'd been a veteran in such and such war because he was fighting for our freedom, and now this is where the war is, and it's a much bigger war. And that guy got arrested like 3 times in 1 week at different sit-ins. And so I think it says a lot just to show this is the continuity of someone who is a real American hero that is fighting for freedom in whatever way they see it whenever it comes. All right, so I mean, obviously the vast majority of people who are listening to this or, who are anywhere are not going to do a sit-in. They're not going to get arrested. That's, even among the resistance, there's a pretty small percentage of people that are willing to go through with that, especially on a repeated basis. But everyone's going to be wondering, what can I do about this? So how can we map out some different ways that different people can get involved? So obviously, if someone lives in New York City, then we want them on the support of the referendum on the city charter, but tons of people, most people listening to this don't live in New York City. So what would you think that what should the average person be doing right now if they just want to offer some support in general to the cause, not just in New York City, but more broadly speaking?
Got it. Call bank. So you can call restaurants and encourage them to not comply. And there are several different ways you can go about that. I suggest you map it out. You can encourage businesses to look the other way. You can encourage businesses to be openly defiant. You can encourage them to join on to other lawsuits because there have been so many lawsuits already filed. You can encourage them to donate to legal funds for anyone who gets arrested. And you can encourage them to do advocacy work with the police. This is something that has been challenging for me to sort of navigate as a libertarian. Generally, I'm not a big fan of law enforcement. And I've had to really kind of get over myself and have a little bit of an ego death with this and reach out to law enforcement and try to communicate with them and be like, hey, this is really important. Would you be willing to take a stand on this? Would you be willing to commit to not arresting, ticketing, fining people, jailing them over these issues? And some of them have said yes, because they're the ones who are doing the bidding, right? And NYPD, fifth largest standing army in the world. It's no joke. But we definitely need to outreach to them.
How do you go about in that outreach? Are you talking about walking up to a cop on the street, or are you talking about going to the precinct and asking to speak to? In what manner do you reach out to police on that front?
So you can send an email. Mm-hmm. You can ask them if they have a statement or if there's a group. You can talk to police officers on the street. You can also arrange for a sit-down meeting. If you're going to be doing a sit-down meeting or sending emails and official requests, it's best if you do it under the guise of an organization, because that has a little bit more teeth to it. But it doesn't have to be formal.
Would that email be at the precinct level, or should it go to the union, or where's the point of contact?
Don't go to the union. You want to go to a smaller group.
Okay.
Start smaller first.
Yeah.
So I emailed in Los Angeles. I just reached straight out to the LA County Sheriff's Office to just their media.
Got it.
LA's a little bit different though. And the sheriff fired back immediately. He was like, here's our official stance. We are not enforcing this stuff. We are not arresting. We are not ticketing. So we got lucky. Now, LAPD is a little bit different, but the sheriffs just said, absolutely not. We're not going to be a part of it. So I recommend that you go to precincts. And if you look online and you start asking around and trying to network, you'll find little areas, little pockets of people who don't want to comply with this stuff. So do a little bit of research, start there, and start branching out. Because I guarantee you that there are police officers who don't want to enforce this. I'm not, again, not real crazy about law enforcement, but a lot of them did actually sign up because they want to do better in the world, or they want to get rid of violent crime, stuff like that. They don't want to be throwing 5-year-olds out of restaurants, and it is demoralizing for them to have to do that. So lean on that, be gentle about it, but use that as leverage.
Yeah, as a real interesting anecdote, I was at the protest to support Kyrie Irving at the opening game of the Nets. Awesome. And the founding members of Black Lives Matter Greater New York, Hawk and Shavonna Newsom, came to that, and the Reverend George McCall, I think it's Kevin McCall, sorry, who had presided over George Floyd's funeral at the request of his Brooklyn memorial at the request of his Floyd's brother last year, and co-led the July BLM protests. Mm-hmm. And the Nation of Islam also showed up. Yeah, and it was quite funny because Hawk had to kind of the two groups, like the New York Freedom Rally, like most of the people in there are pretty pro-police, and so everyone had to kind of calm down their rhetoric around the police. And, nevertheless, Hawk had to put his 2 cents in to make some kind of I'm not on board with the police statement while he was there. Right. But it was really interesting that McCall got up and said, last year we had a slogan, all cops are bad. We're changing it this year to all politicians are bad. And then he had the crowd chanting, all politicians are bad. And it was, it's not that Hawk Newsom was out there marching with the police the next day. But the very next day, the largest protest in the city was when the fire department and the police led the massive march over the Brooklyn Bridge. And so it was real interesting to see where, people who have really strong feelings about the police are doing their best to kind of hold their tongue and do what they can to realize that right now we are on the same side and we have to work together in some way. All right. So last question is, you outlined a lot of ways that people can help on this. There are a lot of people right now, and I was having a conversation with someone the other day who are in a position where they feel like they can't wait for November to amend the city charter because they're looking at losing their job right now. Do you have any advice about, what should someone be doing if they have anxiety about whether they're going to imminently lose their job or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You need to aggressively work the HR chain of command. So my advice is, do not be confrontational. It's very frustrating. I understand that. We're going to have to take the emotions, set them aside in a little box, pick them up later. You need to ask for policies and procedures. What are the criteria for an exemption? What are the medical conditions that you will give an exemption for? Keep asking questions, push it up the chain of command. Ask for meetings, ask for accommodations. I know that it's frustrating and that people want to just lead a charge on this and say, it's just wrong. This is a violation of my personal freedom. But if you're trying to hold on to your job, and it's very important, you need to treat this more like you're a disabled person and you need an accommodation. I know it's frustrating, but that's the best way to tackle this problem at work.
Yesterday, I surprisingly talked to someone who said that they got a medical exemption for their college on the basis that they had anxiety about taking the vaccine.
Yes.
And they got a psychiatrist to sign the letter saying that they had anxiety about taking the vaccine, and they granted that medical exemption. I was floored that they accepted that.
So I wasn't going to come out and say it, but yes, right? I do know a few people who have had that. You've got to, the frustrating thing about all of this, right, is it's additional work. So you've got to just accept that, hey, I work 40 hours a week. I'm being threatened to be fired over these psychopaths or whatever you're thinking of them as. And you just have to say, this is my reality. And it's going to take me an additional 5 hours of work a week to fight it, to try to hold on to the job that I now resent. I know it's not ideal, but just accept it and just move forward, and it'll make your life much easier.
So I want to turn to you a a sub example of that question, because I got an email from someone and I have no idea how to think about it. And so I don't know if you'll have a good answer, but maybe you will. So they say, I'm looking for some advice. My employer just mandated boosters for us, which I'm not comfortable getting for a lot of reasons. My dilemma is that I already got the vaccine,
Right.
and I don't think a religious exemption would be approved.
Right.
I'm going to give it a shot, LOL, but any advice you have to not lose a job over a booster? Do you have any idea how to attack that situation?
Absolutely. That the first series of shots made you very ill, and you are very anxious about going through it again, and you're not sure if you can handle it. And that is that's the reality for a lot of people, which is also another really good reason that we should not shame people who got the first shot. Don't shame them, because this is often the circumstance.
Yeah, well, not yesterday. A couple days ago, or January 5th, I was at the Capitol, in the New York State Capitol, and Tremel Thompson, I think his name is. He's Progressive Action TV on YouTube, and he's a MTA organizer, and he's spoken at a number of the rallies, and he announced for the first time yesterday that he'd been fully vaccinated a long time ago, and then he took out his vaccine card and he said he's never taken it out before, show it to a business because he won't, and he ripped it up on stage. So that was nice. That was quite interesting, and I think we need a lot more of that, because there's it seems to me that everyone who got the shot like August or later did so under duress, and that a lot of the people that got it before that didn't support the mandates. And so right now we got to be at least 10 or 20% of the people that got the shot, don't want to force everyone else to get it, I'm assuming. Right. So that's already somewhere between 40 and 60% of the people. But then I think that I think the number of unvaccinated people has bottomed, and now it's just only going to go up as more and more boosters are required. All of a sudden those people are reclassified, and maybe different, everyone will have their own threshold after which they say, no, I'm not getting another one. Right. And for a lot of those people, it's going to be the third one. And so the number of people that are, forced back over onto our side is just going to go up from here. And, clearly these people are examples of that. I can't imagine anyone who got it and then watched, got it and thought it would all go away and then watched their city turn into a show your papers state.
Exactly.
Why do we have the booster?
and what's going to be next? Because it's not effective right now, as we know. We are right now in the midst of everyone freaking out over Omicron. Yeah. All the people who've been triple vaxxed and they wear masks all the time and they still social distance, they're all getting it. So what is government going to do next? A lot of people are having this very painful realization that their own tyranny did not actually help them or save them. Yeah, I've seen a surprising number of people on the street wearing masks outside recently. Oh yeah, number of people wearing masks on the outside on the street seems to be going up. It's weird. Yeah, people are double masked in airports now with face shields again. So, on that note, let's make this the last question then. Where do you think this is going? So my general view, and I imagine you share this, is this will go as far as we comply with and no further than that. But do you have a vision of what the end game looks like if we don't stop this? I think it's going to look like a strange hybrid of fascism and secession. That there are going to be places where it's mostly normal to live, and there are going to be places that they're just absolute no-go zones, like LA, like New York City. But I do think eventually the narrative will collapse. And I would remind everyone that as awful as this is, it's horrible. The Soviet Union collapsed. That happened in my lifetime. I literally watched it on TV. I remember watching, what's his face? David Hasselhoff smack at the wall. So don't freak out. Don't lose hope because these things they don't sustain themselves forever. They just don't. Eventually they collapse. Well, that happened in your lifetime, but it didn't happen in the lifetime of most people who were around 1917. So it could take a while. So I guess ultimately the end game is going to collapse. But yeah, well, I mean, I guess you do see a lot of hope and you see
Well, I mean, you see at least a lot of hope for these places in the worst case scenario that are going to fragment off and preserve freedom. So you don't think freedom has a chance of disappearing from the face of the earth?
No, I don't. You've got states like Montana and I believe Wyoming that have straight up outlawed vaccine passports. Florida, I don't know if Florida has officially yet. They are on the way. There's a difference between when it's passed through legislation and executive order. So there are places in the United States that are absolutely rejecting this.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. So we are going to amend the city's charter. We're going to change the hearts and minds of New Yorkers and everyone else where we live. And we're going to do our little part to influence who we can, whether it's the police or whether it's the businesses or whether it's the people around us. And we are going to, if we're faced with difficulty in our own job, we're going to bite the ear off HR and insist our way into keeping our job. Is there anything else you want to say to end this? And then where can people find you? Learn more. Oh,
yeah. If you need tips, resources on how to deal with this, please reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter at Angela for LNC Chair. You can find my website at angelamcardle.com. I am extremely busy and overwhelmed dealing with this, but that's because it's so precious to me. It's so important to me. So don't hesitate to reach out. I'll connect you with whatever resource I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angela. This was amazing.
Great. Thanks so much.